Welcome. We are here at the National Equity Project offices in downtown Oakland, California. My name is Tom Malarkey. I'm a senior associate here at the National Equity Project, and I'm here with my dear friend and colleague, Zaretta Hammond, who happens to have written a fantastic book, Culturally Responsive Teaching and the Brain, promoting authentic engagement and rigor among culturally and linguistically diverse students. And we're going to have a conversation about the book, but also about the work behind the book and what the book is hopefully going to contribute to the field in this important moment in education right now. So welcome, Zaretta.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's nice to be here.
A little transparency. So we go back a ways.
That's a long way.
Yes, I think maybe 2000, 2001, something like that. Zaretta's had a couple of chapters here at the National Equity Project, and it was clear that her life's work, however, was to really put into form her profound thinking about what does instruction for equity actually look like. A lot of people talk about this piece, that piece. A lot of people talk around instruction, but really, what are we talking about? So let me ask you a question. Why did you write this book?
I wrote the book because I've been, as you know, out in the field doing equity-focused work for a long time, since about 1999. And one of the things I would constantly see is teachers' desire to really improve the outcomes for students of color, English learners, linguistically and culturally diverse students across the board. But that achievement gap was pretty chronic and persistent. And culturally responsive teaching has popped up over the years as a remedy. But there really was not a lot to help teachers operationalize it. So my desire was to really kind of pull back the curtain and to help teachers who are committed to closing the achievement gap really understand what conceptually is the culturally responsive teaching and how do you actually bring it from this kind of theoretical thing into the classroom and operationalize it so it actually lives and breathes in your classroom.
So in our work, we see and hear folks in schools and districts often talk about, well, we want to do the equity work, so can you give us some culturally responsive teaching strategies? And what is your take on kind of what feels off about the way that culturally responsive instruction is often framed or done?
Yeah, I think the real challenge is it's been too narrow. The way that we've talked about culturally responsive teaching has been very narrow, and I think there are kind of three primary misconceptions, right? It's an engagement motivation strategy, right? Somehow if I just mention Africa or Mexico, students will get excited and somehow get more engaged in the lesson. And that just doesn't happen. There are other reasons why students are disengaged. The other misconception is if I just use call and response, that will be something students connect with, and therefore that will engage them. And even though the lesson hasn't been changed, the content or the process, students will actually now engage more. The third is teachers' notion that they have to know 19 different cultures. So it's what it means for them to actually operationalize it is this kind of overwhelm. And I can't learn everybody's culture, what they eat and the dress and all the nuances if I have 10, 15, 19 different cultures represented. So for teachers, it feels unmanageable and they feel overwhelmed by how do I even begin to pull in aspects of every student's culture into my lesson and into the content.
Yeah. So interesting. So the history of what is sometimes referred to as multicultural education has been around for some time, and people have been trying to figure out how to make education more relevant and not just one dominant culture model. And then we went into the era of No Child Left Behind, where, in my view, those concerns actually got sidelined oftentimes in the press to focus on particular discrete skills and up the test scores so that people didn't, could make their accountability numbers and things like that. But we're entering a different phase now with the Common Core, and I'm wondering what is relevant now about not just culturally responsive instruction, but how you're thinking about it.
I think the Common Core really provides a grand opportunity. It's really full of promise, and I'm really excited about it. The Common Core, particularly the anchor standards, really, demand that we help every student become an analytical thinker, an expository writer, and a critical reader. But what we know is too many students, a disproportionate number of culturally and linguistically diverse students, are on the other side of that. They don't have those skills. They're big learning gaps. So I think a lot of teachers are feeling frustrated. Great standards, but wow, when I look at where my students are actually at, how do I get them from where they are to where they need to be? So I think culturally responsive teaching, when we really understand what it is and are able to operationalize it, is going to provide a path for moving students from where they are, particularly if their skills are low, to a higher order thinking, analytical way of approaching their content.
Right, because it seems that there's nothing about the content of the Common Core standards themselves that will somehow automatically make it more possible for students who have experienced less success in the old set of standards to be experiencing new success. That said, it does feel like it opens the door to some possibilities.
And that's their challenge, right? Yeah. The standards are just that. They're standards. They're a destination. They're where we want students to be. But there's not a lot about how to get them there. There's a conversation around close reading and, more nonfiction versus fiction and the kind of the percentages. But that's pretty much where it stops. So if students are underperforming and they have not had kind of the rigorous content, just giving them rigorous content now is not necessarily going to be the thing that allows them to take it in and actually achieve. So we have to be mindful of how do we get them ready for rigor? This is the question that I've set out to answer, is how do we actually prepare students so as we kind of up the standards, we want them to be more analytical, we're able to actually give them the skills and the tools to do that.
So if any of us individually as educators in our classrooms and our schools, or us collectively as a country, let's say, are going to actually be able to deliver on the promise that the Common Core offers, you're saying you can't go around this issue. You actually have to address it squarely and in more substantive ways even than it may have been addressed in the past.
Yeah, I think the promise of culturally responsive teaching is really being able to bridge kind of the learning gap students have and meeting those standards. So testing alone is not going to change anything in terms of what students know and are able to do. But when we actually learn how to maximize the cultural tools they already bring for learning to the classroom. So we overlook them. We don't take advantage of them. But when we understand what they are and we're able to capitalize on that, we are going to see an acceleration in students' ability to move the needle on their own learning.
That's where I get excited.
Me too.
Yeah. So if you were to kind of give a nutshell version of your definition of culturally responsive teaching and how it might be different, or expand upon other definitions that might be out there.
Yeah, I think that, and here's what I'd say, I don't think that there are different definitions. I think that we haven't always explained how the process works. So some people might talk about culturally responsive teaching as a motivational tool. They might talk about it as an engagement strategy. In reality, culturally responsive teaching is a process. And you have to understand every point of the process in order to actually operationalize it. So what I've tried to do in the book is really explain what the process is, rather than just here's a handful of strategies. Because the reality is there is nothing that is particular to African American students or Latino students or Southeast Asian students that you have to do in order to promote their learning or get them engaged. What you do have to understand is what are the cultural tools that they bring that are in common. So the way that I talk about the process is, first, teachers have to acknowledge and understand the social political context, the racial history that really has created different learning outcomes for students, and what that means for students in their own social emotional acknowledgement of being in a condition, being in classrooms or schools that either don't support them, teachers that don't always look like them, people that don't understand them, and somehow feel marginalized. As students get older, they recognize, I'm not reading. I am not getting the kind of support I need, and they start to kind of pull back and disengage. So to me, that's the first step in the process. The second is for teachers to actually recognize the cultural learning tools students bring to the classroom and not misunderstand those as students being off task. For example, there's a cultural process in which students across different cultures use story as a way to process information. So it's kind of like a story narrative. But a lot of times teachers might misunderstand that as rambling. Just give me the kind of soundbite answer. So teacher has to recognize that as actually a cultural tool and acknowledge it positively, right? Let the student know you're using it and that it's a good thing to use. And then the teacher has to, and the last step is mimic those cultural tools. So use similar ones in the course of instruction so that they are actually able to kind of parallel the tools students bring. See, this is where I geek out on the neuroscience, right? Because there's a whole lot of neuroscience behind why they do that and why that's a particular cultural tool. And two things I'll say here is these cultural tools actually cut across particular cultures. So it's not particular to African American or particular to Latino culture. What you have are what they call cultural archetypes. And it's this idea that there are similarities that you will find in kind of communal cultures. There are also some tools, learning tools, that come from oral traditions. So the memory system is one that if you have not used reading and writing as the primary modes for passing along knowledge in your culture, you actually are using story, you're using song, you're encoding it in other ways that actually uses the brain's memory system. So those are key tools that teachers actually need to be capitalizing on. So the culturally responsive teacher acknowledges the social political context, recognizes the tools they bring, gives students permission to use those tools and respond to them positively, and then mimics them in his or her own instruction.
So that is fantastic, because it seems to me one of the huge contributions of this book is it's taking this realm of brain science, which is informing so much of what we're understanding about learning and about teaching and about how people learn and work in other fields as well. And we've certainly been using that to inform a lot of our work with schools and systems and leaders and whatnot. But you're doing something with it that actually gets into the heart of the intersection of culture and learning with a brain lens. And say a little bit more about that and why that is important, both in terms of the high expectations part and also the culturally responsive part.
Yeah, I think what's really important to remember is that students are social beings, and the brain is a social organ. And one of the things that really gets in the way of learning is not feeling comfortable in your environment. And so this is that social emotional component that a lot of people are talking about. And it is so key to culturally responsive teaching. So in the book, I really try to devote time to showing that connection between the brain's focus on connecting with others. And it is fierce in its protection of that social connection. If it feels that it's threatened, there's mistrust, someone is actually going to be socially humiliating me or demeaning me or making me feel bad about myself, the brain will actually disengage. So it's really interesting to watch this in the classroom. So students feel like teachers don't have their back, or teachers don't understand them, or they don't see themselves reflected, or the ways that they bring to the classroom to learn that are culturally grounded in their community or their home life are disrespected in some way, then they start to disconnect, and then the brain really makes it difficult to get to the cognitive part of learning, because that relationship, that social well-being is so important to achievement in learning.
So what becomes a vicious cycle then can actually get shifted to a virtuous cycle, if you will.
It really can. And it really is, the teacher is a linchpin. So it doesn't really matter what your own cultural background is. It doesn't matter what your own racial background is. What it matters is that you understand where you're positioned and how students perceive you. Right? So as long as they can understand that you care about them, that you are not only their friend, but you also are going to be their ally. You're going to push them when necessary, but it means you earn the permission to push them. And when you have that rapport with students, when you have that connection with them, then they give you that permission for pushing. And I think that's what people forget about what really is the process of culturally responsive teaching. They think it's a set of strategies, and if I just do the strategies during the lesson, I don't really have to pay attention to my relationship to students. But it's just the opposite, because students come from cultures where relationships are at the core.
Deeply matters. So that phrase "permission to push" feels really important, and you want to connect it to something that you talk about, which is this notion of the difference between a dependent learner and an independent learner. And to me, that put language on some things that I've seen with students that I've taught, my own children, and talk about what is a dependent learner and how are they getting produced?
Thanks for asking that question, because I think it's one, particularly when we start our conversation around equity, that gets overlooked a lot. Right? We go to kind of the content and the strategy. We really don't want to acknowledge that when we talk about the achievement gap, really what we're talking about are students who are dependent learners. And what that really means is, without a lot of scaffolding and support, they could not move through the lesson or process the content on their own. That the teacher always has to be nearby or always has to break down the content in a way that the student, it's pre-digested for the student. So what's really interesting about the Common Core is the Common Core actually asks us to stop doing that.
Right.
And this is kind of freak teachers out. What will I do if I can't, pre-digest or front load the vocabulary, do all of these things, 2 or 3 days of content to ramp up? And that's because students are dependent learners. And we recognize them we give the student a task. If they get stuck, they just sit there. They either look at the teacher, help me out here, or they will look at the paper and just sit. An independent learner is one who is just that, who has strategies to not only take in new information, but if he gets stuck, he knows what to do. He knows how to get himself out of this stuck place. And that's what we want for students. I think that's what the Common Core is actually asking us to do. It's not just these achievement marks or standards, but really that every student be an independent learner. I think that's what we mean when we say college ready. We want them to be college ready. So this notion of dependent learner and independent learner is really critical when we think about what we're up to in closing the achievement gap, and why culturally responsive teaching, if we implement it in a way that's about helping every student grow his great brain power, right? So I call it intellective capacity in the book, but it really is simply brain power, helping students be able to process information more effectively because they have cognitive routines.
So this notion of independent learning feels to me connected a bit to what we're talking about in terms of mindset. And, you know, Carol Dweck and others' work is much more out there and informing the work in the field. Is there a connection between dependent and independent learning and fixed and growth mindset?
I think there is a really strong connection. And one of the connections that I've made in the book is within culturally responsive teaching, because the learner is the only one who learns, we have to support students to actually come around to engaging. There's nothing that we can do as teachers if the student does not want to engage. And think of it as the brain, right? Think of it as the brain wants to learn, it pays attention, and attention is the on-ramp to learning. And if we can't get our brain to pay attention, if we decide we don't want to pay attention to something, it's not going to come through. So part of what we really want students to be able to do is to have the academic mindset to say, this effort to pay attention to this feels really important. And therefore I engage. I give it my attention. And once I give it my attention, I go through the process of processing it or engaging, trying to figure it out, grappling. Even in my confusion, I stay engaged. So helping teachers understand the mindset precedes engagement is really important, because a lot of teachers wanted to get students engaged. And what I've been talking to them about is first help students embrace the idea that grappling, effort, failure are all important parts. But up until this point, for dependent learners, many of them have found failure as just something that is embarrassing, makes them feel bad, and they withdraw and disengage.
Yeah. How do you see the connection? Because you talk about accelerated learning, which isn't yet kind of a commonly understood notion, and sometimes we think about, well, if we put that much more information and curriculum into kids' heads, that will somehow result in, you know, increased forms of learning. But that's not what you mean. Acceleration is a different thing. And so talk a little bit about like how independent learning is connected to actually the potential for genuinely accelerated learning for students.
I think in a nutshell, it really is that students are the leaders of their own learning, right? And the degree to which once a student is really engaged and committed to learning, they'll learn pretty much anything. I think about what students do when they're playing video games, and that for hours, they can try and get, you know, the golden egg, and they can get to various levels, and just really hours of really active learning. Learning through failure. Ooh, that's not where he is. I dissolved, so now I have to go and get another one of my
clear feedback there.
My magic coin. So this idea that students really can be the leaders of their own learning is evident in, you know, video game play and any other game-based play. We want to bring that to the classrooms. This notion of them accelerating their own learning, if they could do that with, you know, history or math, that would be phenomenal. One of the things that I see is a really strong connection between kind of the gamification of our content and culturally responsive teaching. And it has to do with the brain. It has to do with this idea of the memory systems, kind of the reward centers in our brain, and that when you are learning something, the brain really likes a challenge. It likes a puzzle. It likes to figure things out. And when we can bring that to the classroom, we make it a much easier on-ramp for them to see a similar way that they use learning at home and that they use learning within their culture. So one of the things that really is critical for teachers to understand is when they can use the memory system to help students get new content, process information, and create instruction that looks similar, you know, and a little bit gamified, then it's going to look culturally responsive, because that builds on the memory systems that students coming from oral traditions are really, really used to. And interestingly enough, the brain creates neural pathways, and so that there's more gray matter in that area. Those are actually the strengths that students bring. It's not kind of a sidebar, and that's really what learning is.
Yeah. So, Zaretta, you have constructed a framework that you call Ready for Rigor, that is kind of the core and the backbone of this book. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I want to walk you a little bit through each of the 4 quadrants. So there are 4 areas that I really feel like as teachers want to build their capacity, they really need to be able to master each of these areas. And then there's an inner ring of 4 core practices. And let me just start with the first quadrant, and that is awareness. So this is really inside out work. It starts not with kind of what you're doing to students or with students, but actually how you're positioning yourself. So learning more about how the brain works, just kind of learning theory and how learning happens, but also understanding your own social political positioning and understanding kind of what triggers you in terms of students, their racial backgrounds, how comfortable you are talking about race, class, and those various issues, equity issues in the classroom. So doing your own internal work is really important, and that's awareness in the first
Which
quadrant.
types of students, which types of behaviors, how is it that becoming more reflective about where you get bent out of shape or off your game
and what actually triggers your brain.
So
it's not just reflection to say, hey, I thought about that, but actually to know when I get in situations in which students are doing X, Y, and Z, I find that I feel threatened, I get angry. So really knowing where your buttons are. I feel like that's a really important part. Knowing how the brain works. It's amazing that, you know, we as educators don't always know as much as we should about learning theory. And learning theory is really not a theory. It is, you know, we're owners of brains and we should know how our brains work. So having that is really important. I think also understanding the different cultural levels, right? So most of us are familiar with surface culture, right? So there's
food
also clothing and music, that kind of stuff. But there's also shallow culture, those unspoken rules about how close you stand to someone. You know, do you hug them or do you shake their hand when you meet them? When you go to someone's house, what's a proper protocol? That's called shallow culture, and then there's deep culture.
But shallow culture does make a difference.
That's right. And so deep culture is really kind of the source of understanding culturally responsive teaching. So that's all in that first area. The next area then is once you've kind of done your own internal work and understood yourself, you are now trying to reframe your relationship with students. And we call this kind of the learning partnership quadrant. And it's reimagining student-teacher relationship more as a partnership, that each participant in that partnership is going to do something different. But you as a teacher are also thinking about how do you reduce the stress from inequity and what we call microaggressions or implicit bias, right? So in the first quadrant of awareness, you're doing some work around implicit bias. That's where your buttons are being pushed. You're just trying to get a better handle on what those are. Here, you're trying to make sure students reduce their stress. You understand that they are navigating this in life. Even as early as kindergarten, students are aware of the social political context and are being affected by it. So you're mindful of that.
So for instance, stereotype threat and how that might play out differently for different kinds of kids.
Certainly. And just being aware of kind of what that is, how you're creating a atmosphere that is much more positive, and particularly in that relationship. Next, you're going to think about information processing. So we move from the realm of social, emotional, and relationship to now the content and the cognitive. So here you are bringing to bear those cultural tools on how you build your own instruction, how you actually deliver your content. So your lessons would look more congruent with some of those cultural tools and ways of learning that students are actually bringing. So being able to really focus on how students are taking in content, how they are actually turning inert information into usable knowledge, connecting it with what they know, what they've already done, building background knowledge, all that good stuff. And then they're moving from that quadrant to community of learners. So back into the social emotional, marrying that with the cognitive, where students are actually in a communal learning space, that they all show up ready to be learners, supporting each other, kind of distributed knowledge. So really creating an atmosphere where students are really scholars. They are coming into the classroom ready to learn, knowing that everything and everybody is focused on that same goal. And the classroom is set up in that way. And it has diverse structures in it for different ways of talking, interacting, collaborating. So some may look traditional, but some may look more culturally congruent with what students do at home. So it isn't just kind of throwing everything we've done in traditional settings out, but it is about creating more of a hybrid. The students actually will need some of the tools that traditional classroom structures give them when they go to college, but they can actually accelerate their own learning if we first build that around their cultural tools. So those are kind of the four quadrants. Then I think there are four core practices every teacher needs to have, and that is affirmation, the ability to affirm the student in all aspects, and really thinking about particularly those things that society tells students to not be proud of, whether that's your skin color, that's your accent, that's your mother tongue. Being able to acknowledge and affirm students for those, because those are aspects of their identity. And you want them to feel proud of those, not just in a racial pride way, but actually that these are resources for me.
Right.
And so being able to give them that.
And that can be done regardless of who the teacher is.
That's right.
And their background.
That's right. It doesn't matter if you're, a white teacher, doesn't matter if you are a teacher of color. Every teacher needs to know how to affirm students in a way that builds on a positive identity development. Then, validating them. So if they're living in a social political context that, has privilege going to some and disadvantage going to other, you have to acknowledge that. You can't be colorblind. So being able to validate students' experience. If young black boys are coming to school saying, I'm being harassed, you have to believe them. And we know from the news that there's more than a pattern of practice that validates what they've been saying for a long time. So we have to take them at their word, and also to say, how do we give them a space to actually reflect on that, reframe it, be proactive, and not internalize it. And so I think the last thing would be being able to give them good feedback, so that they really are being able to think about kind of their instruction and correcting that as they accelerate their own learning. Teachers have to make the space for students to talk about the content that they are expected to take in. So they're actually processing it, but they have to talk about it with someone who can guide them to the next level of understanding. So, we go into classrooms and teachers get kids into groups and say, all right, get in your group. I've eavesdropped on a few groups, and, sometimes it's what's going on Gossip Girl.
Sometimes you don't even need to hear it. You can just see it.
That's right. So the reality is there's a time and place for just getting kids into groups. But instructional conversation is different. This is the teacher This is a more advanced peer or tutor sitting with that student to actually think about how they're processing new content. What connections are they making? How do they understand it? Where are they getting stuck? What does it seem similar to or different from? So it's actually, that instructional conversation is apprenticing students into this cognitive routine. So when you get stuck, what strategy do you use to get unstuck? What might be the first thing you do? So you're there kind of shoulder to shoulder with the student, actually talking out loud. Now this conversation itself is culturally responsive.
Yes.
But there's a lot of modeling and apprenticing as students are given more and more responsibility at home. You're in it, but someone's actually giving you feedback as you're going, but they're in conversation with you as well. So those two go hand in hand. So that means making time and space in the classroom for that. That means knowing how to support students through that kind of conversation. It's not a test. It's not just wrong answer, right answer. It's how do you really coach a student to their own levels of understanding and build cognitive routines in their brain.
Let me ask about something that I think is fairly common, and that is that the conditions of students' lives and how teachers experience those, especially when those conditions are particularly challenging. There's any number of forms of trauma that a student might be going through on a daily and regular basis. And especially if those are conditions that the teacher is not as familiar with in their own life experience. There is the phenomenon of saying, how could we expect students who are going through that to actually learn to these standards? And so you were talking about the validation part, and really the difference between thinking like, well, the poor babies versus actually validating their experience and continuing on.
Yeah, I think it really has a lot to do with resilience theory. It's just that idea that, poverty, social justice, inequities have been around for a long time, but there is a resilience in the spirit of oppressed people that culturally responsive teachers know how to tap into. And it's calling forth that spirit to say, these conditions may be happening, but here's how you can rise above them. Here's how you can take that adversity and actually use that. And the brain does that. The brain actually uses our adversity to build our spiritual muscle, to build our intellectual muscle, to build our moral fiber and character. So the culturally responsive teacher really knows how to tap into that. So poverty doesn't become an excuse.
That's right. And struggle is an asset.
That's right. Struggle is an asset, but you have to know how to leverage that.
Yes.
And that means helping children actually become more resilient, not by, ignoring it, but by kind of transmuting it into this has been kind of the foundation of building your muscle. What will you do?
Can I ask a question? Because people are talking a lot about grit these days, and what's the difference between grit and kind of how you're talking about this?
Well, I think grit it's part of what's in culturally responsive teaching, but there's one way of looking at grit as if students of color just need to get some grit, right? But the reality is, if they've made it thus far, even if they're underperforming through challenging circumstances, living in a racialized society, most of them have got a pretty good dose of grit. And I think we need to reframe that to say, how do we support students to bring that same grit to the effort of cognition, instruction, and helping them know it's worth investing in. So one of the aspects of academic mindset is this work is worth me doing, right? So students actually embrace the idea that I will turn all this effort that I have, all this grit that I have, to something that is important to me. So we have to actually make it relevant. So that's kind of the culturally relevant. Why is it relevant? So, back in the day, we talked about education being kind of the great equalizer. That's what made it relevant for generations of oppressed people to look to education. Now we have to give the newer generation a new reason to embrace it. The Common Core standards. Why do I want to be an analytical reader and writer? Right? You do have to be a critical reader. You have to be able to put your voice in the mix. Kids are doing some amazing things with student voice, and that is a key part of culturally responsive teaching, making space for that to happen.
Yeah.